Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us at this HR Quarterly Updates seminar. I'm here today together with my colleague Maarten van Kempen, and we are very pleased to have you all. And it's a special day for us as well, because it's 1 year ago since we started these HR Quarterly Updates, and we're very happy that you are all with us here today. And we would also appreciate if at the end of our webinar you could fill in the feedback form. We have a QR code you can use to do that, and we would appreciate your feedback so we can continue on improving our HR Quarterly Updates webinar for you. Our program for today is as follows. We have 5 topics: recent case law, recent legislation, intimidation at the workplace, developments around immediate dismissal, and finally, wages and inflation. So I will start today with a topic, recent case law, and the first recent case that I would like to discuss with you is about equal pay. As you all are maybe aware, there has been a proposal by the European Union for an equal pay directive. The proposal has been made last year and was adopted early this year in April. Currently, there are negotiations ongoing about the scope of the directive, and it's going to take some time before they finalize those negotiations. So compliancy with this new directive is not expected before 2024, but still a lot is coming up. So we find it worthwhile to already discuss this with you at this stage, because there is a lot of work to be done, and it could be a good idea to take your time to prepare. One of the things I included in this sheet for you is a link to an equal pay guide, which is a document in English, very useful, provides a lot of information, but also case examples of companies who are already implementing the requirements that they expect to see with this equal pay directive. So this is a very useful document which you can also use as a discussion point to raise this within the company, and also have a look at how other companies deal with equal pay and transparency about pay in the workplace. So now onto the specific case that I would like to discuss with you. This was about an employee working as a legal counsel for Wekamp. She was earning a salary of 4,400 euros gross. A colleague of that employee, also working as legal counsel, informed her that he earns a higher salary, 1,000 euro gross more, and they have the same position. The employee raised this within the company, and after several discussions, Wekamp decided to increase her salary, making it equal to the salary of her colleague. Wekamp, of course, said that they did this all voluntarily without acknowledging any wrongdoing, etc. And the colleague had an employment contract for a limited period of time, which was not extended, which I think is one of the reasons she also felt free to pursue a court case after all this happened. In court, she claimed back payment of wages, among others, and a fair compensation due to unequal treatment based on gender. The sub-district court denied her claim because the court felt that Wekamp based the difference in pay on what they called equivalent standards, and therefore the difference in pay was objectively justified, according to the court. If you look at what those equivalent standards are that Wekamp brought forward, was the number of years of work experience, education, and the type of organization where the employees worked previously. They made a comparison between those two. So the general legal work experience for the employee in question was a lot longer than her colleague, who was getting a higher salary. But specific experience as a legal counsel was less for this colleague, because she started as a lawyer first. And the other colleague had more experience as a legal counsel. And also industry relevant experience was discussed. And Wekamp claimed that the employee in case had no industry relevant experience, but the colleague who was giving a higher salary did, because he was working for Ernst & Young in the past. So based on these so-called equivalent standards, Wekamp said, yeah, we had good reasons to give the other colleague a higher salary. Ultimately, the sub-district court ruled that the relevant working experience and education of the colleague provided a justification for the difference in salary. So the court sided with Wekamp in this matter and said, yeah, there are good explanations for this difference in salary. There was a lot of focus in the ruling on the value of the working experience, which will become more relevant, as I will tell you shortly. The employee was not very happy with the outcome and decided to go in appeal against the ruling of the sub-district court. And in the meantime, she also brought her case before the Netherlands Institute of Human Rights. And the Netherlands Institute of Human Rights ruled differently than the sub-district court. One of the reasons for that, I believe, is that Wekamp actually followed the ruling of the court. And before the Institute of Human Rights provided a different explanation for the difference in the pay between the woman and the man working as legal counsel. So what Wekamp actually did was they changed their arguments, which they used initially in the court case and now before this Institute of Human Rights. So therefore, the Institute also said that they didn't really believe the arguments Wekamp was bringing forward because they had a different argument in the previous court case. Wekamp was now solely focusing on the value of the work experience. The Institute of Human Rights also said that Wekamp did not provide any further explanation why the work experience of one colleague was more valuable than the other, and based on which objective standards this was based. And finally, the Institute of Human Rights said that even if the work experience of the other colleague would be more valuable, that it would still not explain a difference of €1,000 gross between the two employees, which meant that the Institute of Human Rights ultimately ruled that they said that there was a violation of discrimination based on gender because the colleague was wrongfully paid more than the other one. In the meantime, the appeal court, case court was still running, and this ruling of the Institute of Human Rights was brought forward in this case, and ultimately the appeal case has been settled out of court by Wekamp paying a very large amount of money to the employee involved. I think that this is a good example of the discussion that you can expect as an employer based on the Equal Pay Directive that is coming up. So more dialogue will have to take place based on how you are paying your employees, and you need to look at objective standards that you use as a company to substantiate why a difference in pay has been made. Just to be clear, a difference in pay is allowed as long as this is based on objective standards. Okay. Another case law that I wanted to discuss with you is something that is also still very much ongoing in our daily practice as lawyers, and I can imagine also within your company, and that is the discussion between employees or independent workers. This specific case was about a depot manager working for a publishing company called Mediahuis. And Mediahuis decided to discontinue delivering afternoon newspapers and instead focused on delivering morning newspapers. Therefore, the delivery work in the afternoon became obsolete. And as a consequence thereof, Mediahuis decided to terminate the independent contractor agreement with several depot managers. The depot managers in question claimed to be working on the basis of an employment contract and not an independent contractor agreement, and therefore claimed payment, among others, of fair compensation and other compensations. Ultimately, the court agreed with the depot managers and ruled that they were indeed working on the basis of an employment agreement. They had certain elements that they based the ruling on, which is, for example, that the delivery times of the newspaper were determined by Mediahuis. Mediahuis also determined where specifically the newspapers had to be delivered, for example, on top of the bar or in the cafe. Mediahuis also provided an internal website that was used to recruit delivery people for the company. And Mediahuis also did all the salary payments, the administration, and also was the one who decided if someone was not performing and if they maybe needed to be dismissed. And finally, and that is the reason why I wanted to discuss this case with you today, the court also ruled that the work performed by the depot manager belongs to the core activities of the company, which resulted in organizational embeddedness. And this last factor is specifically important at the moment because we have other cases, such as the Deliveroo case, where this same discussion is taking place. And there is a pending litigation before the Supreme Court about this topic. And our Advocate General of the Supreme Court actually advised that not the authority to give instructions is decisive when you determine if it's an employment contract or not, but the question whether the work performed is organizationally embedded in the company, which also was one of the relevant factors in this ruling. The Supreme Court is expected to rule in the delivery case on the 23rd of December, so hopefully a nice Christmas present for all our employment lawyers. But this is something that we at Pallas are also following with a lot of interest because this could have an impact on your company as well if this is going to be a relevant factor in the discussion employee versus independent workers. So we'll keep you updated. Finally, the last case that I wanted to discuss with you is an employee discrimination case, and more specifically, the opportunity for an employer to pursue a policy of neutrality. This, in general, is allowed, but there are certain requirements that you need to take into account as an employer if you want to do that. A policy of neutrality means that as an employer, you set certain requirements on the way that employees present themselves during working hours. More specifically, in this case, it was about an employee who was prohibited to wear a headscarf during working hours. As an employer, you are allowed to have such a policy, but under very strict circumstances, and one of them being that you have to be able to justify that this is necessary for your business operations, that employees do so. In this specific case, it was about a Belgian woman who applied for an internship at a social housing association, but she was not hired because she was not willing to take off her headscarf during working hours. The Belgian court questioned the EU Court of Justice whether the option for an employer to have such a policy of neutrality should be further restricted, because in this case it impacted female Islamic employees more than other employees. The EU Court of Justice actually referred to previous court cases about this topic and actually further emphasized that the meaning behind this is that it is to encourage, as a matter of principle, tolerance and respect, as well as acceptance of a greater degree of diversity, and to avoid abuse of a policy of neutrality being used to actually put workers who have certain religious precepts in the workplace. So this is not so much a new topic or a new ruling, but mostly should be seen as a further emphasis on the high burden of proof you have as an employer if you want to have such a policy of neutrality in place. And you need to be able to very thoroughly substantiate and also prove that that is necessary for your business operations to do so. Okay. Those were the recent case law topics that I wanted to discuss with you. We will move on to the recent legislation topic. And I would quickly like to discuss with you the Whistleblowers Act. We have one in place in the Netherlands already since 2016. And a few years ago, an EU directive was brought up in this regard, which has forced the Dutch government to review and update their Whistleblower Act to make it compliant with this EU directive. We're actually late implementing this, so there's a lot of pressure on the government to get this done as quickly as possible. And they are now working on an updated Whistleblowers Act for the Netherlands. And in that regard, there has been a memorandum of amendment from the 1st of November, which is actually the third one so far. And this amendment has certain implications for your Whistleblower Act policy. One of the things that they have amended is the definition of a wrongdoing, which will be extended to a violation of internal rules that involve the public interest. So not internal rules with regard to individual cases, but internal rules involving ultimately also the public interest, which seems very broad, but I think that there are not a lot of cases that will follow under this scope. And they have also further described internal rules because it have to be internal rules that entail a specific concrete obligation and that have to be established by the employer on the basis of a statutory provision. So it's good to take into account that this is a new definition of what will be considered a wrongdoing under the Whistleblowers Act. And in addition to that, there has also been a further explanation about what should be considered public interest. And that is the situation where the social interest is in any case at stake, or if it not only affects personal interest, but there is also a pattern or a structural character, or if it's a serious or extensive omission. So we now have a bit more of an idea what is considered wrongdoing and public interest. So far, this is still a legislative proposal, but be aware if in your current HR policies you have a topic about whistleblowers and you are strictly following the definitions of the Dutch Whistleblower Act, make sure to update your policies in a timely manner. And we will, of course, keep you updated when this will all go into force. Okay, Maarten.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to talk to you on another topic, of course, on the recent legislation, and that is, of course, the fact that the Dutch pension reform has been delayed. It has been in the papers. First estimated date was January 1st, which would be in a few weeks, but it has been postponed until July the 1st of 2023. However, the ultimate date of the transition period will remain December 31st, 2026. I mean, the plan was, okay, we will have this new pension legislation in place on January 1st, and then we would have 4 years to adapt to this new pension legislation. So we could change all our pension facilities. We could change from the defined benefit to the defined contribution schemes. We could change the different rates, etc. The fact now that legislation will be in place 6 months later does not imply that this transition period will remain 4 years. It will be 3.5 years. So for companies, there is no reason not to start preparing. The most recent information that we have is that the government is still very dedicated to pulling through this legislation through Parliament. We know that there have been some sort of, let's say, it has been questioned from other sides, but especially the unions and the employers' organizations. They really feel that this is in the interest of all people to have this legislation pulled through. But that also means that you will have to start thinking of changing. And the question is, okay, what does it mean? I made this timeline for you for that, and here you see what we're going to do and when we're going to do it. I mean, new pension plans need to be flat rate defined DC, the defined contribution plans, by 1st of July 2023. But of course, then that's the topic. But of course, you have 4 years to do that. There is an exception for insured defined benefits, of course, which could be amended into agreed-based defined contributions, etc. Of course, very important is the submission of this transition plan in case of an insurer of a PPI. This has to be done before October 2026. But in the end, we have to take care that you have to identify first whether the applicable pension schemes need to be amended. That's your first thing you should do. And then, if you are, for example, have a works council in place, identify at what stage you plan to involve the works council, as they will have a right of approval. And in that aspect, I also added some flowcharts on this Dutch pension reforms for you, because you will have the slides, of course, sent to you if you're watching this update. So one is for the DC pension plan, and the other one, of course, is for the DB pension plan in place. And that brings me actually to my second topic I would like to discuss with you, which is intimidation. I mean, intimidation in the workplace has been a topic more than once, of course, but very much, especially in the Netherlands, in the media, in the last months. We've seen it on television shows, we've seen it in politics. And one of the main things I would like to discuss with you is that the International Labour Organization actually had a treaty in place, which is called ILO 119. This treaty actually, this convention was put in place already in 2021. And because of all these happenings that we had also in the politics, in the media, the unions have actually requested now to the government to actually to adjust the Dutch legislation, especially on sexual harassment and violence. And the things that they want to achieve is that there should become a more independent complaint handling. I mean, how are you handling your complaint procedures? And they want this to be an independent complaint procedure. And very important, the ILO had in its convention that the definition of the workplace, which we have now, will be broader. I mean, it's not only the workplace itself, but it also will involve clients. It will also involve customers. And let me show you how that works. First, some figures. Did you know that at least 5 to 10% of the working population already experiences violence and harassment at some point? And that is only in Europe. Do you know that in the Netherlands we have 1.1 million employees who are at some point a victim of internal undesirable behavior? And do you know that the survey of our human rights institution already found out that about 16% of employees are victims of sexual harassment, which is huge, if you would say this. So there's all the reason to move forward with this. Well, let me tell you a bit more about this ILO 190, this convention. You should know that the International Labour Organization is a United Nations agency. And we have 187 member states who are a member of that agency. And they're all part of this ILO convention treaties. And this ILO was installed to set labor standards all over the world. And of course, it is very different when you're talking about, for example, labor standards in Nigeria or in Afghanistan, or when you're talking about our decent European Union. Although, looking at the figures I showed you before, how decent are we really? Well, this convention, which was discussed and actually adopted in 2021 by the ILO, which means that all 187 countries, and then we're talking about the unions, we're talking about the employers' organizations, we're talking about the governance, they adopted this convention, and they made this specific definition of violence and harassment. And well, of course, it's always a bit broad, and here they state it is the unacceptable behaviors and practices or threats thereof. That is more or less what they said. And if you look at it a little bit further, where can this intimidation take place in violence? They're talking about this could be in the vertical relationship, which is the manager-employee relation, also horizontal, in between colleagues, which is happening a lot on the work floor. And of course, there is the third parties, which is clients, patients, and users, because also these people, our employees, need to be protected from clients who are harassing our own people. So that's also what this ILO convention is aiming for. And this convention is aiming for what they call integrated approach. And this approach means that if you look at how it is structured, for example, in the Netherlands, we have employment law, we have working conditions law, we have penal law, all sorts of laws on different parts of law, which in total should protect people from being harassed, or where you can find enforcement. So they're more trying, this convention is trying to make it a more integrated approach. And of course, it's about protection and prevention. It's about enforcement remedies, and it's about, very important, guidance, training, and awareness raising, because training and awareness is probably one of the main topics here. Well, when we look at the current Dutch situation, and when we're talking about, for example, protection and prevention, when we're looking at ILO, so what do we already have, and is it already in line with ILO? And I can say, yes, we're quite in line already. But very important, of course, is that risks with regard to psychosocial workload should be assessed in the context of this risk inventory and evaluation, the RI&E. And measures should be determined and implemented to prevent that. Which means in your risk inventory and evaluation, which you do from time to time, you should take into account this intimidation problem. Another point, what we also see in current Dutch legislation already, of course, in the working conditions decree, which I listed above, is, of course, that workers should be informed and educated on the risks. The question is, do we do that? Is it something that employers actually do? Because that's also what it's all about. Because when we're looking about the measures you could take when you're looking at these RE&I, we're talking about the confidential advisor. You probably have one. The code of conduct, the training, the complaints procedures, recording of incidents, and of course shelters after incidents or aggression. All sorts of measures which you can think of, but which you also should put in your RI&E. And you, of course, you have to discuss these, of course, with your works council if you have one. And I mean, that's all about prevention. But when we're talking about enforcement, then of course in the Dutch situation we have three. We have the employer's liability. Employees can hold you liable if they're being harassed. That could be by a manager, it could be by a colleague, because it's your obligation as an employer that people are safe on the work floor. Of course, we have the non-discrimination and equal treatment, which is at the College of Human Rights, and we have the working conditions law, which means that, of course, the labor inspectorate can do an investigation and they can do a sanction. So that's actually the enforcement. In the Netherlands, you should know that only half of the labor organization have an RI&E. And in many cases, it does not meet its requirements. That's what research tells us. And of course, only 1/3 of the confidential counselors has had specific training. And another point is, there is actually, now we do not have a legal basis for this confidential advisor. I mean, the confidential advisor that we instate in our companies, for the complaint rules and the confidentiality, there is no legal basis for that. It's based on a policy. And that is what actually ILO wants to change. They say you should get a legal basis for these institutions? Well, that's all about, of course, prevention. I mean, we're also talking about disciplinary actions. When we're talking about the disciplinary actions, we're talking about the people who are actually harassing. And that's also important because when you as a company receive a complaint somehow, that could be from a confidential advisor, it could come through you as HR, it could come from anywhere. The first thing you should do is establish the facts. I mean, it's easy to submit a claim, but is the claim true? So you have to follow an objective procedure also to establish those facts, which means talk to the complainant, but also talk to the person who's accused. And that's sometimes important, because sometimes you get an anonymous complaint about, so you know who the accused is, but you don't know who is actually complaining because it's coming from a confidential advisor. But investigations are important here, because you have to look at the interest of both the complainant and also those who are accused, which means you have to put in some sort of hearing. You should hear both sides. And even after you've heard both sides, and you have been able to establish more or less the facts, then it comes to the measure, because what measure is appropriate? Should he be dismissed? Should he be warned? What is the best measure in that specific situation? Which is quite difficult, but we're always happy to be of service there. So, before we go back to Michelle, who will talk more about those disciplinary actions, I would say the best you can do first is to have a solid RI&E with a plan of approach in monitoring and have a good complaint procedure in place. Now we continue with more of these disciplinary actions, and she will show you how difficult it is to do the right thing.
Thank you, Maarten. So, a question we get a lot related to intimidation at the workplace recently is, can we do an immediate dismissal or not? Which is always a difficult question, because you may have heard it before, it always depends on the specific situation, if it's possible or not. An immediate dismissal or instant dismissal is still bound by certain rules. One of the rules is that it has to be immediate, and it also has to be about urgent reasons. So the situation should be serious enough to consider an immediate dismissal because of the fact that the consequences for the employee are very large. Next to the requirement of immediacy and the urgent reason, there is always the personal situation of the employee to take into account. I'll also discuss one case about this topic as well. And finally, which I think Maarten already discussed before, you have to be able to prove the behavior of the employee based on which you want to have an immediate dismissal. And of course, this is where it can get tricky with regard to intimidation in the workplace, because more than often this happens without any witnesses. So it's one side of the story versus the other side of the story. And if that is the case, you need to be very cautious before deciding to go ahead with an immediate dismissal, because the urgent reason for the dismissal needs to be proven. And that's also something to keep in mind, and I think which is also a question that we get in our practice now very, very often, which is also the reason why we wanted to discuss it with you today. So what I have done is I have selected 4 cases which are about immediate dismissal related to the behavior of an employee, and they all talk about different criteria, so to say, of immediate dismissals, starting with one case about the factor of immediacy. The court ruled in this case that immediacy is determined based on looking at the time at which the facts that you want to use for your immediate dismissal were known to the person who is able to grant a dismissal. More specifically, in this case, on the 7th of March, this manager was informed about the sexually transgressive behavior of the employee in question. It took them a whole month to confront the employee with his behavior. They did that on the 4th of April. Then they took another 8 days to perform an investigation, which I think by itself can sometimes be a reasonable amount of time, because you need to take your time to sit down with people, have discussions, and allow other people time to respond to that. So in itself, I think a week for an investigation could be reasonable. But then it took them another 2 weeks to give the immediate dismissal. So I think you won't be surprised also by the way I'm sharing this story with you, that the court ruled that this immediate dismissal was not immediate. And I think the largest fault or error here was in the fact that the manager took a whole month before confronting an employee with the behavior that led to the immediate dismissal. So please make sure that if somebody comes to you with an anonymous complaint or just a verbal complaint or any notification of incorrect behavior, make sure to act quickly. Another topic around immediate dismissal that Maarten also already just mentioned is the principle of hearing both sides of the story. And this is not only actually hearing both sides of the story, so sitting down with people, but it's broader than that, this principle. In this case, this immediate dismissal was cancelled because of the fact that the investigation that was performed was not adequately, and the notes and statements from this investigation could not be checked by the employee who was dismissed, and he was not able to check this for correctness or completeness. The case doesn't specifically say why he was not able to do so. I think it could be that the employer wanted to keep it confidential, or because it was all anonymous and therefore he could not verify who said what and when. And that in itself can also be a violation of this principle of hearing both sides of the story. So only sitting down with people and having a conversation is not enough. You need to be able to give both sides the opportunity to respond to allegations and allow them to come up with a defense against what you are claiming they have done. And if this is not possible for the employee, then that could be a reason for the court to cancel the immediate dismissal because you did not give both parties a chance to give their side of the story. So this is important to take into account when you are dealing with such a situation. Furthermore, proof is always a difficult one and at the same time a very important one. As I already mentioned, immediate dismissal has very serious consequences for the employee. They lose their entitlement to salary, to unemployment benefits. So the reason for the instant dismissal should be proven by the employer, or at least, because sometimes it's not possible to prove something with 100% certainty, but at least it should be clear in all reasonableness that the urgent reason for the dismissal actually took place. And this in practice is difficult because, as I already said, often these things happen without anyone else seeing it. So it's two people accusing each other of something that happened, and one gives a certain version of the story and the other gives a totally different version of the story. And if there are no witnesses to further help you build this proof, then there is a risk that immediate dismissal is not going to withhold in court. which is sometimes also very unsatisfactory because it may be true what happened, and then not being able to prove it might prevent you from giving an immediate dismissal, which of course does not leave out other options to deal with the matter. Immediate dismissal is only one of the sanctions, of course, that you can use when an employee has shown behavior that is undesired. In terms of proof, I have selected a case where the employer was not able to prove that the reason for the immediate dismissal that they stated in the letter had actually happened. So the reason for immediate dismissal here was that the employee left a work project, also delivered incorrect work, and also had shown some undesired behavior towards the client and the customer of the company. And the employer was not able to prove that. They made an attempt, though, and what they did was they had a statement from a colleague that supported the claim of the employer, but the statement was not signed by the employee that would have given the statement. And therefore the court said, well, I'm not going to take into account this statement at all. First of all, it's been made by someone still working for the company, so you can expect him to give a statement that's in line with the story of the employer. But also the fact that it wasn't signed was a reason for the court to disallow this statement, or at least not take it to account with the ruling. So this is also a risk because, of course, if you have witnesses, you want to use them by getting statements. But please be aware that this is also not always something that's going to convince the court, at least if they are unsigned. But even if they are signed, there may be a limited value to those in court. In this specific case, this was one of the reasons why the immediate dismissal was cancelled, because the employer was not able to prove that it actually happened, what they were blaming the employee for. And finally, I have selected a ruling that was about the personal circumstances of the employee. This is something that you always have to take into account when deciding if you are going to go ahead with an immediate dismissal, because there are situations where the personal circumstances of the employee can outweigh the interest of the employer to have the immediate dismissal. In this specific situation, the employee claimed that his personal circumstances should indeed lead to a cancellation because of his age. He was 58 years old. He was not able to find another job after the immediate dismissal. And he stated that as a consequence of this immediate dismissal, he was now facing a divorce and was also being forced to move out of his house. The reason for that was that the reason for the dismissal was that he touched another colleague's breasts during working hours. And he brought forward these personal circumstances, but the court did not follow his plea and said, well, what you did was so severe and severe enough that your personal circumstances here do not outweigh that. And therefore the immediate dismissal was confirmed by the court. So please do not forget about these personal circumstances when considering immediate dismissal, but don't be scared that they will outweigh your reason for the immediate dismissal too soon. Maarten.
Thank you. This is we're coming now to the last topic, which is something that we as lawyers and you, of course, as companies, but also your employees are facing, which is huge inflation. As you can read, the unions have put in a wage demand increase of 14.3%. That's what they want to achieve in the months to come. What we know from research, Towers Watson, who put out a survey to many employers, who actually indicated, well, we're thinking about increasing salaries by 3.8%. That's a 10% difference. So the question is, how will this develop in the months to come, knowing that the labor market now is more or less in favor of employees. Because research and the survey also shows that companies struggle to attract talents. 93% of the employers is having problems attracting the right people to come. And the same goes for companies who are struggling to retain talent. 89% has problems to keep their best people on board. 89%. Which means somehow there is already a salary race going on. People hopping from one company to another, making 10% more. You're losing someone, you have to attract someone else. To attract the talent, you probably have to pay him 10% more. So that's probably also a way of how this labor market will continue in the coming months and maybe 1 or 2 years. Because as long as this labor market is in favor of employees, the salaries will increase. The point now is when we're looking at these salary increases and the inflation especially, because of course the reason for this inflation is not only the labor market, but it's also because really the cost of living are huge. Everybody has read about it, everybody's feeling it. And one of the things that now people are looking at, especially employees and works councils, is should we or should we not get an inflation adjustment as an employment condition? Are we entitled to have our salaries adjusted to the annual inflations or not? Well, that question can be answered quite easily. I mean, if in the employment contracts you have a clause stating that the wages will be adjusted annually on the inflation, you're stuck. But you have contracts which have conditional and unconditional inflation adjustment clauses. So carefully look at that. The second one, of course, is do you have a collective labor agreement? I mean, if a collective bargaining agreement says that the wages should be adjusted, you're quite stuck. And the third one, and that's one we see a lot coming, is it's not in the contract, it's not in the collective labor agreement, but well, we've been doing this for the past 10 years, which actually was quite easy because we had an inflation rate average about 2%, 1%. So it's not very problematic to index the salaries over those years. But then the question arises, by doing so over the past, let's say 5 or 10 years, what does that mean for the situation now? I mean, are we talking here about an acquired right or not? Well, this will differ per company, this will differ per situation. But what we do know when we're looking at acquired rights, we are also looking at a Supreme Court decision of a few years ago who actually stated some points of interest you should look at and which courts should look at. And one of the things is the content of the course of conduct. How have you been doing this over the past years? Another one, I think, which may have importance, is the length of the period during which you may have indexed your salaries. I mean, have you been doing that for, let's say, 3 or 4 years? Has it been going on for 25 years, all the years along? Because we know we've had inflations, of course, now over the past period of, let's say, 2%, but we've also had inflations of 3, 4, 5% in the past. So if there has been some sort of continuous indexing over these years, that could be a point of interest for a court to say, well, there may be an acquired right which may enforce you to increase the salaries. And especially the one I would like to point out here is also the nature and the size of the circle of workers towards whom the course of conduct was followed. Have you been indexing this for all your employees over all these years? that may be a point of interest courts will look at when we're talking about whether or not there is an acquired right. Well, if you doubt as a company whether or not an acquired right is in place, please feel free to contact us and we'll be happy to analyze this together with you. And then, why should you do that? Because the question is, of course, can the employer successfully refuse to index the wages? Well, if it's not an employment condition, you can. But given the specific circumstances here, it would be wise to explain to employees why you've decided not to fully index the wages. But if it is, for example, it's in the contract, then there's not much room, of course. But sometimes you have conditional employment conditions, which means that there is room in the clause itself not to fully index. And maybe it is something for you to consider, to put this in your contracts. That if you say, well, it's not that we don't want to raise wages, but we need to be sure that under certain circumstances, and this is probably one of them, when inflation goes up with these huge percentages, which we cannot fully put forward to our customer or client base, that there can be some sort of mitigation there. And then, of course, when we're talking about employment conditions that leaves no room, then it comes to something else. I mean, accept that it's not possible, especially if it's in a collective labor agreement. But if it's not in a collective labor agreement and there's just a contract, you may try to reach an agreement with your works council, try to reach an agreement with your individual people to see if they would be willing to accept a lower indexation than the standard inflation rate which we are facing now of 13%, 12%. And then there's all the question whether or not you could more or less as a company enforce such an indexation. Because you may have a good reason why you cannot pull through this indexation, which probably has to do with the fact that you are already a company facing some sort of trouble. So if you're already facing financial problems, you probably have a reason to make such a proposal because you're talking about the continuity of your company. But then, of course, you'll have to look for some proposal which is what we call reasonable. Well, that's also when is something reasonable, which could be, for example, something when you're looking at the current situation, which we see many employers do, that we are willing to pay out, let's say, energy compensations instead of a full indexation, because you know the indexation will continue over the years to come. And of course, such a compensation may help you convince employees accepting these specific circumstances, as long as he's been helped to go through these economic severe times that they're facing as well, because we also know that a huge part of our employees base is actually really suffering financial problems. And that brings me to the end of our update for now, for this winter update. You see here the QR code which you can scan with your telephone probably. We really hope you learned and you enjoyed watching this HR Quarterly update, and we look forward to seeing you early next year. Thank you very much.